everybody. My name is Todd Caplan. I'm an ecologist with a company called GeoSystems Analysis. And been working on the river, actually starting here at Santa Ana about 26 years ago. The discussion today, and these were great presentations and a perfect segue into sort of, we've talked about processes, and now, what's been sort of the result of these changes in hydrology and sediment transport. I'm going to be focusing primarily on vegetation establishment, what's established and how is that, how the birds, especially the fly catchers, responded to this. So over the last week, when I got asked to do this presentation, I put this together with a focus on answering just a couple of questions. One is the proportion of, so if we think about the 1992 engineered channel, 600 feet wide, that's really where the vegetation is moved in. And if you overlay the channel bank lines from 1992, for the most part, all the way up and down the river, the current river channel is within that 1992 bank line. So we were able to do some analysis to figure out, what proportion of that 1992 channel is now occupied by vegetation, how has it changed over time, and then is the vegetation in different reaches of the river dominated by native vegetation or non-native vegetation or both, and how have avian species responded. I didn't want to be too hand wavy today, so the best data set that we have really is on flycatchers. Reclamation was kind enough to give us the most recent data set from 2022, so we can present that information and look at where they colonized within this active floodplain. So I kind of went over what we did, but in a nutshell, this is what it looks like. So we took what was the 600-foot channel width from the 1992 aerial photographs, digitized that, and then we quantified the acreage of the river bars and the channel over time in between that 1992 bank line. We did that for 2006 and for 2016 for this presentation, and then we used the 2016 Hink and Omar vegetation mapping that Reclamation did, and we boiled it down into general vegetation types. So, pure native, pure exotic, mixed native exotic, and so on. And then we broke this out for the Isleta Reach and the Santa Casa reaches by subreach. I didn't have the time to do it for Albuquerque too. So the subreaches, the breakout that we used were similar to the collaborative program reports that we did about 10, 15 years ago. There was two reports. One was called the Restoration Analysis and Recommendations for the Isleta Reach, and then for the Santa Casa reaches. So, these can be split up based on geomorphology or any other thing. This is more kind of landmark based. So we'll start with the Isleta subreaches, the Los Lunas, Belen, and Sevietta subreaches. Each is about, 12 to 15 miles long. So looking at the three reaches, all right, across the top, and then we have acres. These numbers here, 924, 1,000, 116, and 874 is actually the acreage of the 1992 channel area for those three subreaches. And then what we did was we took the Hink and Omar vegetation types, the general types that we created from that data set, and we looked at what percentage of that 1992 channel area are now occupied by the channel, native riparian veg, mixed native exotic riparian. There was a xeric woodland component in there as well. Basically, what we see as of the 2016 vegetation mapping, that about 41% of the 1992 channel is now active channel. Okay, there's not vegetation established in that. It's open water. Okay. The vegetation that's established in the Los Lunas subreach is really dominated by native vegetation. It's primarily willow, cottonwood, and when I say willow, it's both coyote willow and Billings willow. And there's other native species in there as well, but those are really the dominant ones. The next group is mixed native and exotic, so you start to see a lot more Russian olive and salt cedar and Siberian elm as well on the islands, but very few of the bars are dominated by purely exotic riparian vegetation, salt cedar, Russian olive in this subreach. All right, so then if we look at the same in the Berlin subreach, you see less active channel, you know, not a whole lot less, but 37% of the 1992 channel is actually open water, as it's called in Hinken-Omar mapping. 47% though of that channel area is dominated by native vegetation. So a lot more native vegetation in that subreach compared to Los Lunas. And then if we look at the Sevietta subreach, you've got even less, only about 32% of what was the open channel area of 1992 is now open channel. And then the vegetation, when you get into the Sevietta subreach, there's a lot more non-native vegetation. It's mixed in with the native stuff. You still only see about 4% of the area as being dominated by salt cedar or salt cedar Russian olive combination. Majority of it really, it's kind of evenly split really between mixed native exotic and native riparian. So this is showing the transition from open channel in 1992 to vegetation encroachment in terms of acres here. In 1992, that's the bottom here. It's basically very little is vegetated, right? In the three different subregions. 2006 in the dark blue and 2016 in the light blue. So you can really see that there's been a huge jump in the proportion of the area that's been stabilized by vegetation just in the 10-year period between 2006 and 2016. About a 60% increase in the 10 years here, greater than that. This, well, actually about 50% here, but in the Sevietta subreach, it's really jumped up over 60% of the area has increased in terms of vegetation cover. Again, it's not just a bunch of seedlings, we're talking about pretty diverse structure and species composition, dominated by natives through the Los Lunas and Berlin subreaches in particular. These are dense stands, and a lot of them have tiered multi-canopy structure. So it's pretty impressive. I think some of the tallest trees that you see in the background might be on the terrace behind, but all of this vegetation here is on, I think what Mike was calling, the bank attached bars. Depending upon where you are, the elevation between the riverbed and the top of that bank can be pretty low. So for breeding flycatchers, and so when I have to be careful with terminology here, the data, the way the attribute tables in the GIS for this show, it's like that depends on the year, but I think back in 2003, it was like T for territory, P for pair, and then PN for pair with nest. So when I talked to Fish and Wildlife Service about what do these attributes mean compared to male, female, which is the current stuff, they said use the pair and pair with nest to equate to male, female, which is a nesting pair, essentially. Doesn't mean there was a nest there, but it means that there were multiple detections throughout the survey period, and there was likely a breeding pair. Okay, so with that confusing statement, there were very few in 2003 male-female pair. They were all concentrated down in the Sevietta Subreach. Okay, and there's overlap here. There was a bunch around the Puerco, not too far from the Puerco confluence. So this looks like one triangle, but it's actually 3 or 4. And then in 2011, really not much of a change. We did start to see some pairs moving up into the Berlin Subreach. But it's interesting, you don't see a lot of movement. The birds are pretty, I guess, they don't move far from the sites that they historically nest in. They might move a little bit, but they generally stay in the same location. They call it nest fidelity. But you start to see some pairs moving up into Berlin, and a couple up here. Here's 2022. Thinking about all that vegetation that moved in the 10-year period between 2006 and 2016. So by 2022, there are, I will refrain from using any superlatives that are appropriate. There's a lot. There's a lot, and they're really hardcore concentrated in this Berlin subreach in particular, but even in the Sevietta subreach, they've expanded. When we looked at, using the 1992 channel, and the way Mike described it, and RE2, it's the active channel now between those 1992 bank lines. This is what I'm calling the historic floodplain outside of those banks. Was able to plot that data to get an idea of where these birds nesting. Are they in the historic floodplain or are they in the active floodplain? And you don't see a whole lot of change in the historic floodplain in this reach. But then you show the active floodplain where all this vegetation is moved in, and it's just a freaking explosion. I think that's pretty impressive. So that's what we're dealing with here. So hard to ignore this when we're talking about the idea of managing vegetated islands in the active floodplain. This is just for flycatchers. What does it mean for a whole bunch of other critters? I don't know, because I don't have data on them. But we can imagine flycatchers as an indicator species, of biological productivity in the riparian zone. All right, so we can do the same. We did the same thing for the Santa Casa Reach. Again, broken out into 3 subreaches, not based on morphology, more on landmarks. The Escondido Subreach, the San Antonio Subreach, and the Refuge Subreach. Refuge Subreach, by the way, goes from the north boundary of Bosque del Apache down to San Marcial. Okay, so we have the data organized the same way for this reach, and it's a little bit different. So the channel area is about the same as it is upstream. About a third of the area is active channel compared to 1992. But look at the vegetation that's occupying the bars. Much lower percentage is actually pure native. Only about 2% of the area is dominated by native vegetation. 61% is mixed native and exotic. Interestingly, none of it is pure salt cedar or Russian olive or combinations of the two in the Escondido Subreach. It's really a combination of Russian olive, salt cedar, coyote willow, baccaris, cottonwood, the usual suspects. In the San Antonio Subreach, so the Escondido Bridge down to the north boundary of Bosque del Apache, about 45% of the area, so it is more channel area relative to the other subreaches in here that are still active channel. Again, though, the same pattern where a small percentage of the vegetated islands and bars are actually pure native. It's a lot more mixed, exotic, and native stuff. There are an increasing amount of pure exotic stands as you move further downstream. And similar kind of trend here. Okay. Now, I think what's sort of interesting about this reach, and the data is presented the same way. 2006 is the dark blue, light blue is 2016. You can really see that a lot of the vegetation establishment on the islands actually happened, you know, between 92 and 2006. There's not much of a change between 2006 and the next 10 years. A lot of those sediment bars have already been established by vegetation, and there's not a lot of what we call safe sites, that bare sediments, bare moist sediments of the vegetation, especially cottonwood willow, need to establish. They were already occupied by vegetation, so we really don't see much change at all. And here's some photos from Bosque del Apache to kind of give you a feel for that. So here's 1996, not long after the annual, you know, vegetation clearing that reclamation used to do had stopped. You know, here's the same spot in 2006. So if you just go back, you know, a lot of those sandbars are now covered with vegetation, just like 2006. And then you shift to the next one for around 2020, there's really not much difference. 96. Didn't switch photos, sorry. But there should be a lot more Russian olive salts here in this picture. But here you go. You know, we still have a lot of dense stands. There is multi-story vegetation on a lot of these islands. It's not a biological desert, but in terms of flycatchers. So for the most part, in 2003, and you'll see the flycatchers have really been concentrated in the refuge subreach. You know, here was a couple of stragglers up in the north end of the Escondido Beach. But then by 2011, you know, there's maybe more in the subreach, but it's still in the refuge subreach, not in the subreaches further upstream. You know, and it's interesting thinking about, again, the vegetation that had established on these bars. Now look at 2022, excuse me, same story. You know, they're all just concentrated down around Bosque del Apache, and really none in the subreaches upstream. Now, I guess I'll get into this. The issue of historic versus active floodplain is a little challenging. It doesn't really kind of falls apart when you get down to Bosque del Apache because of the channel conditions, the perch conditions that Mike and Ari were talking about down there. So there, the historic floodplain is a lot better connected at moderate discharges than it is further upstream. So take this separation a little bit with a grain of salt, because remember, this data is showing mostly pairs in the refuge subreach. They're not further upstream in the lesser graded sections. Okay, but still, you know, there were more flycatchers in 2011 in the refuge subreach than there are in 2022. Here I'm sort of highlighting, you know, why this falls apart when you overlay the 1992 channel, because of this is the location of the channel realignment. So it falls apart a little bit, but I just took the data, you know, and I'm not supposed to be too specific about where the flycatchers were nesting, but pretend for a second that they might have been nesting in here, and I, you know, put them in the active channel category here. So the key takeaways here are the 1992 engineered channel, sound like a broken record, is the contemporary active floodplain. All right. The riparian vegetation that's colonized these sandbars, you know, really began in earnest in the 2000s, associated with the droughts we were having in 2001, 2, 3, 4. And in the Santa Casia subreach, a lot of vegetation moved in, especially during that time period, during those droughts. And that vegetation is mixed, native exotic primarily. The vegetation, especially over the last 15 years, has expanded dramatically in the Isleta Reach. But that vegetation, especially in the Los Lunas and Belen subreaches, are dominated by native vegetation. Swiftle pairs have increased substantially in response, and in the active floodplain. You know, they're not going out into the overbank as much as they are in the active floodplain. So any thoughts of managing vegetated islands in the active channel really need to carefully weigh where the flycatchers are and what the suitability of the habitat is, but also on on ecological functions associated with river flood activity. I mean, when I first started doing, thinking about restoration planning here about 20 some years ago, there was very little, if any, overnight flooding that happened in the historic floodplain. The channel was wider, and we were like, what do we do? How do we get more overbank inundation? Everybody needs to see lateral connectivity. So we've started doing work to do restoration and get that lateral floodplain connectivity. And now people are saying, some people are saying, well, maybe that's a problem in some areas. So we have to be super careful that we're not shooting ourselves in the foot by any ecological gains that we have by focusing too much on, engineering solutions that aren't accounted for those. And, when I talk about ecological functions, just things to get, people thinking and talking about it is, we know that there's reduced conveyance capacity in sections of the river. We're seeing overbank inundation, even in the Albuquerque Reach, at lower discharges than we did back in 2005. And more area that gets inundated for sure. Definitely the case down in the Isleta Reach as well. That connectivity, when we get overbank flooding and inundation of that historic floodplain, does wonders for primary productivity, benthic macroinvertebrates, the whole nutrient cycling, the whole trophic web is enhanced by the dynamic of flooding. Same with the life cycle of species. We know it's true for a whole plethora of different species, including fish like in silvery minnow. Export of organic material. When you get overbank flooding and it's washing organics back into the main stem of the river, contributes to periphyton and the development of other food sources for silvery minnow and other aquatic species. So we can't just be thinking about it as single species management. The flycatcher is a great example, and I highlighted that here because it's easy to connect the dots with it. But there's a lot of important ecological value to the flooding that happens both in the active floodplain and in the historic floodplain that we need to consider. I do have a few questions. I'm not going to be able to stay for the afternoon, so I wanted to put out a couple of questions for the workshop folks and that are going to be able to stick around and help to really clarify what are the concerns. So if we're talking about managing vegetated islands, I get a little nervous, because I think about going back to the 1992 paradigm. I hope that that's not what's actually being talked about, but I think no matter to what degree this is being discussed, it's got to be, and I know Artie's thinking about that through all those slides and their whole process. But what are the specific concerns, and where are these specifically concerns? There's, as he said, there's not a one size fits all. This is not an issue system-wide. Where specifically are the problems and what are they? And what data exists to support the supposition that removing vegetation from these islands will alleviate that problem? I hope it's data-driven and not just going on, what people feel. I'm a sensible guy. I like feelings. There's a place. what are the potential unintended consequences of doing some of this work? You know, let's keep a mind not only on addressing things like conveyance and impacts on non-engineered levees. Okay, let's think about the ecological implications of what we're doing too. The other thing is, are there alternatives besides vegetation removal of on the islands? You know, one of the things that, you know, for example, if you're having problems with overbank inundation, instead of, you know, removing vegetation so that you have better conveyance, can you identify areas where you can maybe do a little lowering of a channel in floodplain, not a flow through channel per se, but basically an off ramp, a drainage channel in specific locations. With today's technology and LiDAR and the models that folks have between the Corps and the different agencies, reclamation and so on, should be able to pretty accurately pinpoint where it would be strategic, makes sense to put in strategic drainage channels to get that water back into the Jamestown River, rather than having it cool and evaporate in the floodplain. So